Women are the natural leaders of the species. Ancient Egypt had it right. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. Welcome to 2024. We are back for episode 8 of season 8, continuing our series on Netflix's The Fall of the House of Usher. So join us as we become more obsessed with Poe than we already are.
Well, hello, listeners. We are back from our winter holiday hiatus that we decided to take. Ordinarily, we run some reruns during the Christmas and New Year holidays, but this time around, we just decided that it would be best to just take a few weeks to ourselves. And I know that I am rested, refreshed, and ready to dive into 2024, and I hope Mel and Lisa are as well. But we are returning to finish up our watch through of Fall of the House of Usher from Netflix, the Mike Flanagan series. And this episode, we are going to be focusing on episodes 5 and 6 of the series. So, just to kind of kick it off and get it started, these two episodes are based on the Poe stories, The Telltale Heart and Goldbug. And of course, if you've been listening to our watch through so far, you'll know that these stories are more inspiration for the plot of the episodes than they are literal actual interpretation. There's definitely overlaps and allusions, but Mike Flanagan is doing a bit of his own thing as well. Also, just a bit of a disclaimer, I am not in my usual more secluded part of the house while we're recording this due to some technological issues, so there may be some extra pet noises because our dogs are loud sometimes, but gonna try to stay muted when I'm not talking just to keep that down. But just wanted to let you listeners know that we may have some extra guests occasionally. So, like I said, episodes 5 and 6, they're based around the Telltale Heart and Goldbug. Um, and they still continue with the plot arc of Roderick visiting with Auguste Dupin and um, kind of telling the story of how he got to where he is with all of his children dead in sitting in a rotting, falling apart house. And just like with the previous episodes, each of these two episodes focuses essentially on the death of one more of his child, particularly episode 5, The Telltale Heart, that focuses a bit more on, um, I just blanked on her name, Victorine, I believe. Um, and then episode 6 is focused on Tamerlane, and we'll deal with more specifics on who they are and everything as we talk about it. But just for my overall impressions, this is kind of, it feels like the show's really picking up steam with these two episodes. I know there's only 2 episodes left after this. It's an 8 episode series, but there's a lot that happens in these 2 episodes, not just in terms of the Poe references and allusions and the deaths of the children, but we get a lot more revealed about specifically Verna and what happened on that New Year's night in 1980. There's still a lot of mystery there, but there is some more revelations, and we see a little bit more of Madeline and Roderick interacting as well. And it really, I feel like these 2 episodes were really good and set up the final 2 episodes pretty well. And full disclaimer, I am sticking to my plan of actually watching through this series as we do it for the podcast. So I watched episodes 5 and 6 just a couple of days ago. It's been very difficult for me to not just go ahead and binge the rest of the show, especially since we had several weeks in between our last episode and this one. But I am trying to keep it as a fresh watch through for me. So I'll turn it over to Mel or Lisa to kind of give your impressions on these two episodes, or just general thoughts on the series as a whole. Now that we're 6 episodes in, and we can go from there.
I guess I'll jump in here. Yeah, I agree with you, Matt, that I think these two episodes are setting things up for as we get to the end of the show. And I think particularly the Telltale Heart, I'm not as familiar with Goldbug, but I can kind of see how the story is in the episode. Of course, you also, I guess, have some echoes of Tamerlane the poem and Tamerlane's life. But the Telltale Heart, in particular, that's a story that I've taught many times. That's one of my first Poe stories that I heard someone read on the radio when I was a little kid staying at my grandparents' house. That kind of got me into Poe. So it was interesting seeing the take on that in episode 5. I too have not watched the last couple episodes because I decided I wanted to keep myself just thinking about what we know as we go and we talk on the podcast. And I feel like I'm agreeing with you a lot here, Matt, but I also liked the way we learned more about Verna's character. She's probably the character who fascinates me the most. It's by saying that, it's like I feel like all the characters are unlikable, which isn't a bad thing. But it's almost like even though she is doing some pretty terrible things, it's like the reckoning, as we talked about, I think, on the last episode, in a way that sets her apart from them. And the kind of mysteriousness about her, I find really fascinating. And I thought it was really cool what they do with her, and when they find out her background, episode 6. I also thought the Arthur Gordon Pym references in 5 and 6 were interesting. To be honest, as we go through this, I may actually talk about, like, get the episodes kind of confused, because these two episodes also, because they're setting up the final two, don't fully like focus on Victorine in the one, and Tamerlane in the other. Like you were saying, Matt, there's a lot more with like Pym and Roderick and Madeline trying to find out who Verna is, and the kids trying to figure out where they stand as their paranoia rises, which is like madness straight out of Poe's work right there as well. So I feel like as we discuss, even if we're talking about one episode or the other, I may even like just say something that came from the other, because I feel like the two work so well together to not only knock off the children that we need to be killed, um, sadly or not, as the case may be, but to also like just set up like why all this is even happening, because we know more and more as we go that something happened on that fateful day 40 years ago with Roderick and Madeline, and they're having to kind of pay the piper here. So that's just some of my, I guess, takes or reactions to these two episodes and how they kind of work together. Lisa, this is, I think, your second time watching through, right? It feels like it's been so long since we talked about these.
Yeah, because I'm the one who, as soon as the show came out, binged everything I could. I absolutely couldn't wait. It's very hard, especially listening to you and Matt talk, knowing what happens in the next 2 episodes, that I feel like I'm just kind of sitting here. Like, I'm glad I was on mute while you were talking, because yeah, it's going to be really hard for me to talk about the things in this episode knowing what I know is coming down the road, but I will do my best. I agree with everything you've been saying. That I think this is where, in particular, like a lot of the plot lines kind of started converging for me in the series, and it felt more solidified, as opposed to just, oh, we're building character, or we're learning a little bit about this. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about Verna in particular, because Mel, I know you mentioned Verna a little bit and how you're very intrigued by her. And, I don't think this is a spoiler to say that I still think about her as one of my favorite characters in this whole series, even after everything. Um, and she's still a bit of a mystery. So, yeah, I guess, yeah, that's not a spoiler to say she's still a bit of a mystery. But on revisiting these two episodes, um, I think of all the deaths of the siblings. Obviously, I think episode 5 stuck with me the hardest. um, it I mean, it had kind of the gore aspect that we saw with the big party death. But this one felt so much more intimate and close, and we had gotten to know the characters that much longer. So this really felt like a twist of the knife in the heart for me watching this. It had so much more emotional resonance. And um I mean, I think too, knowing the Telltale Heart, which is probably, I would venture to say, Poe's most famous story, it makes sense that that one was put here, because in so many of Flanagan's works, episode 5 seems to be like the turning point where things really start moving in high speed toward the climax. But I do want to float something that I've been thinking about to you guys now, since you've been watching it, because I've been thinking about Verna and just kind of the nature of what she's doing. And I know something, I know something that's coming that I won't talk about, but um, it seems to me that she's very deliberate. I've noticed this the second time in how she enacts. I don't know if you want to call it revenge. Um, Mel, you alluded to the fact that, like, obviously they're having to pay for some sort of kind of like deal they made, or something, like the reckoning is coming. I'd always think of her as like, um, she's kind of the tax collector here, coming to take what's owed. But I was thinking about this because I really think in a lot of the deaths we've seen so far, maybe not the first one so much, but the subsequent ones, she has kind of a pattern. And the first step is to like break you apart from the people you love. Whether that's, when we saw the Murders in the Rue Morgue episode, when it was just, she lost her assistants who she was sleeping with. They said they were in love and they kind of walked away from her. And then it's like this sudden descent into madness. And usually that madness is something that's been dangled there, right? Like, for instance, the Murders in the Rue Morgue. First, you had her companions, for lack of a better word, leave her, and then she gets obsessed with like having to sneak in to the Rue Morgue and having to get the information, and that leads to her downfall. And it's the same thing like with the black cat with Leo. He gets in a fight. He loses his, I don't know if it's a boyfriend or husband. I think it's a boyfriend. I can't remember now, but loses his boyfriend. And then there's the cat that drives him mad, like hearing it in the walls. And that leads to everything, that leads to his downfall. And I feel like in both of these, um, we see something similar, right? Like we see the breakdown of the kind of family unit, if that's what you want to call it. And I'm guessing that's practical on Verna's part, because she's really only going after the family members. Um, but in this case, like, we do have collateral damage. that isn't related to the family. I don't know. Like, I'm really curious about this whole, like, Verna's approach seems to be like, I'm going to isolate you and then I'm going to drive you into madness and that's going to lead to your death.
No, I see what you're saying there. But while you were talking, I was wondering. Obviously, it's Verna's MO is to isolate them, which then, as it goes, leads to more and more paranoia. Because like now they've got bodyguards, and there's 3 kids left, and they don't know who to trust. And we find out that they've been kind of pulled along in this because there was no informant. So it shows how weak their connections were anyway. Roderick even has that speech where he talks about how he set the kids against each other before this all happened. And so that's kind of what I was thinking while you were talking is yes, it's Verna's MO, like whatever connection they have, she messes with. And also like the way she kills them in their quote unquote madness, like comes from within themselves too. Like she doesn't place the madness there. Like you said, it was already kind of there. It's just like she's a provocation in a way. I think this works especially with Tamerlane. But the other thing I was thinking is that she doesn't have to work very hard to isolate them. I was watching episode 6 today, earlier today, and there's that scene where Tamerlane goes to try to find her father, which they all have such a weird relationship with him because he's completely unreliable, but they're always obsessed with him and as a father figure. And Juno is there completely alone. And she talks about how when she got married, she thought she was getting a family because she had always been alone before and lonely, but instead she was lonelier than she already was because there was never anybody around. And it almost seemed to kind of get to Tamerlane a little bit, probably because she just got her isolation served to her that you mentioned, Lisa. So I feel like there's a really interesting, like, both and here that Verna is simply she's simply working with what was already there from the beginning. Like Roderick and Madeline already kind of operate in this way and set this situation up, even with whatever bargain they made with her that we don't even know about at this point. And so it doesn't take much for her to push the buttons that were already there to cause these things to happen. So I like that idea of like, it's supernatural to a certain extent, but she wouldn't be able to do what she's doing if it wasn't already some groundwork laid of these issues in their lives. Makes them easier to manipulate.
Well, and I think we did discuss this in one of the previous episodes, but one thing that I find interesting about Verna's MO, if you will, is that she seems to give each of the people a way out, or like there's a moment where she's questioning them or talking to them, and even though it's pretty much predetermined based on their character and based on how they act and interact with the world, what choice they'll make, she does kind of give them a choice. Not directly, because I am thinking of Victorine, where she asks her, because she's posing as the patient who's going to be in the human trials, and she asks her if she'd rather be famous or do good in the world, and then makes some kind of comment about how Victorine has always skewed more towards one than the other. Um, I mean, I think that's really intriguing. That I mean, it does almost seem like she's trying to give them, if not a choice, at least a moment of clarity. Where if Victorine were completely honest with herself, she would say, "Yes, I have chased fame more than actually helping people." And she would maybe change course, or at the very least have the self-awareness of who she is and some of her motivations, but she doesn't. I mean, she doesn't. She's in the middle of her own kind of psychotic episode with the hearing of the heart beating. But I mean, it's almost like here is here is who you are, and perhaps even how you could be better if you just have the clarity of self to even recognize that. But no, you're all a bunch of selfish jerks. and and you all have very distinct flaws, and I don't know. I find that part fascinating as well, because they're even though even though their deaths are inevitable, even I mean, I think we know this even from before it's revealed in the plot. Like, they're all going to die. They just have to, if it's going to be the fall of the House of Usher. But there is this moments where perhaps things could have been different, but they weren't.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I can't say too much because I feel like, well, Verna does show a few cards towards the end. So yes, they are in a um they are in kind of a death of their own design. I guess that's what you'd say, because you're right in that they have been kind of given a choice, but also given who their character is, eh, they're not going to make another choice. I think we see that a lot with Tamerlane's episode, which we can talk about. But um, real quick, because I do want to mention this a little bit with Victorine and her wife. They now or girlfriend. I can't remember any of these relationships. I'm sorry, guys. Her significant other. Um, was it at the beginning of this episode? Because I think we've seen it already, where Roderick, we see him kind of putting this sword, the like Japanese sword, up against himself, like he's going to kill himself, but then doesn't.
Yeah, that's in this one.
That's in this one, right? And of course, Victorine, is his daughter, and then ends up essentially doing what he couldn't do at the end. And I do find this really interesting, and it also makes it kind of heartbreaking, is that we see kind of repeatedly, I guess one of the fatal flaws of the ushers is that they choose this like life of fame and glory and riches over their love and over their family. But it seems like she was the one, I mean, even though she was doing that because she was arguing with her girlfriend slash wife over the trial, and like what was ethical to do and what wasn't, and that's what leads to her throwing the statue. Was it a statue that she throws at her? Um, and but I don't think she never intended to leave her. You know what I mean? Like she never, I don't think, intended for that to happen. I just find it really interesting that she's the one who can't, who doesn't like make the conscious choice to choose work over love or work over family, even though she is doing that, like with her whole thing with the trial. But it's not as like conscious of a choice as we see later with Tamerlane. And then she's the one who's able to do what her father couldn't do, which is take her own life. I don't know. It was a nice mirroring moment for me. I don't know if it means anything more than that, but I just I thought that was a nice mirroring moment in this story.
I think Victorine's story is sad because of those things that you're mentioning. That you're right, like she doesn't quite have the earmarks of all the other Usher children, but Frederick tells his daughter that all the once he and Tamerlane are the only ones left, that only the real Ushers are left, that they shouldn't care that the others were killed because those were the children that had different mothers. And when you see Victorine with Frederick and Tamerlane, I think when they try to come together, I guess I'm not sure what they're trying to do. Victorine thought they were trying to come together. They ostracize her because of that, and so I like how you're pointing out that she kind of mirrors Roderick in a way, because all she wanted was to prove herself like all the Usher children, but she also, like we've mentioned before with the other kids, has that added problem of Madeline and Tamerlane and Frederick and maybe even Roderick to a certain extent, not thinking of them as quote unquote real ushers, I guess. So that issue I think is something else that she struggles with, and the sadness of when she realizes what she did and kills herself, we assume out of guilt, kind of like in the story, or this idea that your conscience kind of will push you to realize what you did. She kind of almost like reaches out for him at the end, and I thought it was kind of shocking. With I think one of the last things she says is "daddy" or something to that effect, like very much like childlike, like reaching out for someone to help them. And the very first scene in episode 6 is he has just done everything he needed to do to get evidence out of that room so that they all won't get in trouble. And it was like there was no it looked like maybe Roderick was going to have a change in the meeting with Victorine, but he just turns back into, this has wrecked the board, we need to take control of the corporation again, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think you're right. Like, I think Victorine unconsciously was doing what everybody else does, but that was part of her madness. And the fact that she, I guess during her psychotic break, couldn't remember what she did because it was just so horrifying. But I mean, it was also disturbing when she killed her significant other, because she's looking at that bookend the whole time she's leaving because she doesn't want her to tell anyone. And so it feels like a murder to me, even if it's just off the cuff. And then while her significant other's dying, she keeps telling her it was an accident, it was an accident. Like she's trying to convince, and that was really disturbing. So, I mean, I think while there's sadness in her situation and conflict, and it's more unconscious, she still has those same tendencies. Those tendencies are what she wants. She wants to be an usher. She wants to be the thing that her significant other thought she wasn't. And I guess that's kind of the tragedy of that particular situation.
I mean, truly the tragedy, as you're describing, is that she's been striving so long to prove herself an usher, and then she finally does in the worst way ever.
Yeah, precisely.
It's really haunting, really haunting. Of course, then we have Tamerlane, which I think this is a good moment to kind of step back and talk about her and her episode. I I mean, even though I feel like if I was gonna pick, probably the most heart-wrenching moment, episode 5, absolutely. But this one really stuck with me too. It was Tamerlane's whole story was an interesting one to me, because I think you really saw what it meant to be raised an usher like your whole life with her, and how much like that messed with her ability to even have quote unquote normal relationships with people. Like you see her and her husband throughout the course of the show, like doing these. I mean, that's how they bring Verna in, as they invite her in as like part of their play acting for I don't know, for the only word I can like grasp right now to describe what they were doing. But I think yeah, I mean, you really see Tamerlane, you really see her break down in every single way over the course of this. And I thought this was an absolute fascinating look at madness and somebody just mentally and physically crumbling in front of our eyes. Um, it was something I thought about a lot. And the mirror, I mean, the mirror. But we'll get to that imagery too, I'm sure. What are your thoughts on Tamerlane?
I felt personally of all the people so far, she may be one of the more sympathetic ones. Not that I'm completely sympathetic to her, but she definitely doesn't feel like so, some of the others definitely I didn't like and thought, oh well, these are horrible, especially like the first to die, whose name I'm just blanking on, the one who threw the rave party. I just did
Prospero.
not. Prospero.
Well,
Thank
they
you.
called
Yes.
him Perry for short, but he was Prospero. Yeah.
But yeah, like him, I really just did not like. Same with the Black Cat storyline. That like he was not. He didn't seem as redeemable as some of these. Like Victorine felt more redeemable, and so did Tamerlane. And but especially that part of her madness is coming from the fact that she's not sleeping, and she's not able to sleep. That I mean, I don't know if either of you have ever experienced bouts of insomnia, but I mean, shoot, that was a pretty interesting and, dare I say, kind of accurate portrayal of what it's like to be running for a long time on very little sleep. Like she was having these time lapses and also some hallucinations as well. And I think what really got me about this episode is how she has these moments where she's actually making the right choice, but it's happening either to a hallucination or after the fact. Like there's a moment where I mean she has this big fight with her husband because she's jealous and thinks that he's like in love with or trying to actually have sex with the Verna portrayed prostitute, and they have this blowout. He leaves, and at one point he comes back and she's talking to him, and she almost basically says like she doesn't say I'm sorry, but it's like makes the moves towards mending fences, and then there's that jump cut and she looks around and then she just sees his keys left on the island because they're in the kitchen. And it's like, so either that was a hallucination or it didn't happen in the right time. Like they had their interaction, but she was not actually interacting with him. And like that's just kind of heartbreaking to me because it's like, oh, she of all the ushers so far has the most steps towards realization of her flaws, but in the end she still doesn't have redemption. She has her reckoning as well. And that I don't know, that really sat with me. And her death too, which like you said, Lisa, we'll get to that. But um that was something. I'll just say that scene of her death is definitely still sitting with me.
Yeah, I agree with you, Matt. We have two, 5 and 6 are two of the deaths we can have. We find ourselves having sympathy for. And I love what you were talking about with the loss of sleep. Like every character is dealing with what they call madness from a different reason. Roderick talks about how he's mad because he dreams during the daytime and doesn't sleep, and that's part of his health problem. And Madeline says her madness is her intelligence, like quoting straight from a Poe work. But the loss of sleep and whatever Verna's doing to her is really messing her up. And yeah, it's tragic that she sometimes says the things she really wants to say when she's disconnected from everyone else. But the other thing I thought was a tragedy with her, I mean, she's the fixer kid. She's the kid who wants to be in control, and she's a perfectionist. She sees everything that the ushers mean riding on her. She says at one point she doesn't want them to just be seen as pill pushers. She wants them to be seen as people who can sell healthy things. And for her, it's like a mission, like the change the world mission that the ushers had. But instead of like hurting people, I guess she's trying to help people, even though she could be hurting people. I mean, I don't know if her stuff really works. And then she's using her husband as like a brand and all of that. It's all problematic. But the fact that she wants to kind of help rehabilitate them is she feels like it's all on her shoulders to make it all work now. And the scene with her and Madeline before the rollout where she loses her mind, Madeline was putting so much pressure on her. And she admits that she's sad that Bill is gone and she misses him, and Madeline just basically slaps that down. And you see how Tamerlane has been damaged not only from her father but from her aunt, and how much Madeline has tried to make Tamerlane her, and how much that should not have happened. And that moment really got me too. And I mean, in the end, like you guys said with the mirrors, like I'm not going to go too far ahead, but she's struggling with herself is what she's doing. And that's the manipulation that happens with her. And so, yeah, I mean, once you see that scene between her and Madeline, and Madeline's like kind of controlling her and trying to turn her into a little Madeline, basically, you realize that she had no chance to get out of this, unfortunately. And it's kind of like the end. She seems to be realizing that in a way that the others didn't. Um, I think Victorine kind of realizes it too. I guess those are our two that kind of realize what was going on, but they don't completely like. They still follow the path.
Something else occurred to me as you were talking about all the sibling deaths um, that we've seen so far. And this is just something that kind of, I don't think it necessarily means anything. I think it's just kind of a fun, I mean, I'm assuming it's a fun kind of Poe reference. But I noticed it again in particular in this episode because this episode I think is a really beautiful one to watch. Um, the actress who plays Tamerlane, she was also in Midnight Mass, is just, I mean, she's fantastic to watch. Like I love looking and seeing what she does on screen. But when she's in this big, beautiful apartment alone, and it does veer into that like hallucinatory, almost like dreamlike state of when you haven't slept, like Matt was describing. And of course, like the mirrors breaking and all that. I mean, that's just it's compelling imagery. But in particular, when she's going through this, I mean, it's almost a very like there's a lot of gothic imagery here, but I don't know if y'all notice like how green um these scenes are colored. And it reminded me, because of course we watched when we recorded this the last time, the Black Cat episode. Um, and his was colored very yellow when he started going through the hallucinations and like, you know, um, going after the cat in the wall and breaking it down. And it kind of made me think about this, and I think part of that is just because they are having these like hallucinations, they are delving into madness. It reminded me a lot of like the colors in Suspiria, especially the original one. Those kind of like vivid, you almost feel like you're in that kind of fairy tale horror world, you're not in the real world anymore. But it really did make me think upon the second watching that the first episode, where you see, or the first death you see, which is of course Perry's, and it's the Mask of the Red Death, and you have the whole party like succumbing to essentially the acid rain that's down on them. And if I remember right, it was a very like red colored, not just the blood, but like um the actual coloring of the film. And that was the first time we saw Verna, and she was dressed in her mask, and as a party goer. And in the story, the post story, The Mask of the Red Death, he's being chased through all the rooms, and they're all different colored rooms. And of course, English teachers love to tell you the symbolism behind all of that. I don't necessarily think like they all match up here, but I think it's kind of a nice thing that I feel like we're literally seeing in front of our eyes Roderick being chased by the masked figure through all these colored rooms. Like we never actually left the big party that was presented to us in episode 1. Like I don't know, I think that, like I said, I don't really think it means anything. I just think it's one of those like nice touches that is a nice Poe reference. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading way too much into it.
I mean, I definitely noticed the green in Tamerlane's episode. I'm thinking back to the Black Cat episode, and I want to say I remember that as well, but it's a little fuzzy. But that's really interesting
Yeah, just
idea.
keep that tucked in the back of your head for future deaths, because if I'm remembering right, I think we might see some different colors.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, that the colors might be representing that this is all following Roderick, because we find out what's in episode 5, I think, a little bit, but also in episode 6, that Roderick all of a sudden says he knows how every single one of the kids died because they came and told him, and we find out that he sees them all the time, like their ghosts are constantly with him, and so he's like haunted by it metaphorically, but he's also literally haunted. And so I like the idea of the visual kind of compartmentalizing the deaths of the kids in like this like kaleidoscope for like Roderick and Madeline, because I mean they're being haunted by something that they did. That's the other thing that I find kind of sad about this, even with the characters that it's hard to find sympathy for, is like, even if they're offered a choice, we know they're going to die somehow, because Verna says you can die quietly or you can die like this. And it all goes back to that New Year's Eve party before all of them, except for 2, were born. And yeah, I don't know. It's almost like they're little set pieces or pawns in this larger thing that they don't understand.
You don't know how badly I wish I could say something right now, and I'm not going to say it. I just really need y'all to finish this show so we can talk about it.
Oh yeah, I imagine we're going to get answers to these questions, but I can only speculate right now. So yeah, I mean, I feel like we're getting close to an ending point here, but we probably, since we did talk about Victorine's death, we should probably talk about Tamerlane's death. And Matt, I know you said earlier that her kind of final moments were very striking. Yeah, I mean, that whole sequence, I'm going to remember that for a long time. The idea of the breaking mirrors, and then the way she kind of accidentally does herself in at the end, even after her realization, perhaps, that she's not just that she messed up the event, but that she messed up her life by kicking Bill out, and all of that. One of the things I thought was really interesting about the end, and I don't know if this was intended or not, but I immediately thought of the story, William Wilson, where a man kind of tries to be two sides of himself, and he faces his doppelganger. So it's like when he's doing bad things, I guess, or making poor choices, his good doppelganger comes and like bothers him about it, or points out, from various reflective surfaces that follows him around, what he's doing wrong. And he ends up, spoiler alert for a story that was written in 1800s, like at the end killing himself because he's striking out against the doppelganger. And of course Verna is like a doppelganger to Tamerlane the whole episode, which is something that Tamerlane craves. She doesn't know who she is. I mean, she has the image of herself, and so Verna plays off of that. And so I thought that was interesting, the kind of William Wilson twinning doppelganger, not knowing who you are, what the kernel of your personality is, focusing on image, and the fact that she kind of like, I don't mean this in like a suicide aspect, I guess, but kind of, I mean, it is a death of a self, because she kind of like almost has none. I mean, that kind of like fighting with herself in the mirror, she kills her image, she kills herself, I suppose. So I don't know, they may not have been thinking about that story at all, but once I knew mirror images were involved, I immediately thought like that doppelganger kind of theme. But Matt, I know you mentioned earlier that the final scene where she, is kind of faced with her mortality, was something that really stuck with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was mostly it wasn't anything deeper than the image of it happening. And I mean, like you said, she's sort of going through the house being chased through the mirrors and taunted by Verna and smashing each mirror. in turn with, I think it was a golf club, if I remember right. But the final moment comes from the mirror that's above the bed. And by above the bed, I don't mean like as a headboard, I mean as like a canopy, which we're not really super aware of until she's standing on the bed and looks up and, just like in all the other mirrors, sees Verna instead of her own reflection, and she jumps up to hit it and break it. And yeah, you it goes slow motion, which was haunting enough because, good lord, seeing someone impaled by glass in slow motion is not something that you can get out of your brain easily, at least not for me. But that's basically what happens. And because of the slow motion, you can see that realization, like you said, Mel, of, oh gosh, I've messed up. And the actress is so good because just in her facial expression, because there's no sound, but the facial expression, it really could be, oh man, I have screwed up in this moment by doing what I have just done. But also, like Lisa was saying, I have screwed up my entire life. And but yeah, I think it's just the slow motion, because there's already broken glass on the bed because there was a mirror headboard as well. But uh yeah, like as she falls, that comes up and impales her from behind, and then the rest of the glass impales her, and then it goes into regular time. I mean, I don't know, it's just the visual of it all was just very, maybe it's just me, but like I had a hard time watching, even when she shows up as a ghost later on. Well, I say later on chronologically in the series, but when Roderick is talking with Dupin and he sees her walking on broken glass, like slowly, like that kind of image just always, like, it's like nails on a chalkboard for me. Like it sends shivers down my spine, and not in a like good way. It's a oh dear God kind of way. And so maybe that was part of why it stuck with me so much as well. But yeah, just that the whole visual of it, I mean, it's very well done. And like it's still in my brain, and it's been a couple of days since I've watched these episodes.
Yeah. Matt, I was like you. That image was seared into my brain. But it was also just so it was so just almost pretty to watch. I mean, for lack of a better word, but just to see her, like, she's falling very elegantly. And like you said, there's no sound, and it's just kind of these like glittering pieces of glass coming down, until it's going to end in something horrific, and it does. Um, but Mel, yeah, I'm glad you brought up the William Wilson story, because I was so enamored of the visuals that I hadn't even put that together. But in that story, like, he actually, when he goes to stab the double, he actually stabs the mirror, right? Like, it's a physical mirror at the end of the story. So I think the fact that she has I mean, she doesn't have like a sword or a knife, she's got a fireplace poker, but I mean, that's what she does. It had to have been a reference to William Wilson. I just, yeah, it had to have been. um, yeah, just I think I'm just giddy in how many like Poe references they managed to stuff into this show. This is so much fun. All right, well, I guess that is it. I'm just really anxious to finish talking about the next two episodes. So I'm really glad that we're doing this, and I hope you are enjoying it as well. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page as well. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon, or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. The music by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.